We are here with the GraphGeeks webinar about halfway through the year, so excited to have George on. George Anadiotis is, as many of you probably know, has been in the industry for several decades. He is the founder of Linked Data Orchestration, as well as the powerhouse behind Year of the Graph, which is a newsletter, report, and analyst services. Also co-founder of Connected Data London. So he's provided a lot of support for the community, as well as research, knowledge, and services as well. And so we've invited George on today to talk about the research he's done and the trends that he's seen through the first half year of 2024. So we can kind of look at what's happened, which has been a lot, and also what's going forward. So George, I can turn it over to you. And if you need me to do any screen shares, just let me know and I can do that.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be here. And well, likewise, I'd like to thank you, in fact, for the work that you're doing with GraphGeeks. And I know it's a relatively new initiative, and I'm happy to see it grow. And I'll be happy to engage with people today and take questions and just have as much as an interactive conversation as possible. Probably the most natural way to do it would be to sort of follow the order that I took in the latest issue of the newsletter. From all the news in the first 6 months, give or take, of the year, I thought that probably the recognition that knowledge graphs got from Gartner was the one that was bound to get the most attention from people, both from the initiates, let's say, and also from people who are not really that much well-versed in graphs. And well, there are a number of good reasons for that. First of all, first is the fact that just hearing the name Gartner is sort of bound to turn people's heads. So what are these kind of big analyst firms thinking of, and what do they see coming up in the market? And also the fact that I thought that the specific reference made by Gartner was of real interest, put into the context of what's going on more broadly in the market. So let me explain a little bit. What Gartner did, they recently published their emerging technologies radar, as they call it. So this specific publication is obviously, as you can tell from the name, it sort of tries to highlight which of the emerging technologies that Gartner sees in the market are the most important, and it classifies them in their traditional radar visualization, in which they try to highlight the ones that they think are most important in the center, and then they have these concentric cycles going from there. I thought that this was particularly interesting because they chose to put knowledge graphs specifically at the bullseye, so right at the very center, as what they call an enabler technology for pretty much everything else. And that's a theme that we've seen playing also with something else in the last period. So since the emergence of large language models, people have been experimenting with those, and by now we can sort of say that we've had some exposure and we're able to tell what these models are good at and what they're not so good at, and what their weaknesses are. And one of the main weaknesses is the fact that they're not exactly trustworthy, let's say. So regardless of how you train them, and regardless of what kind of corpus you would like them to use to answer your questions, they can't always be trusted. And one of the ways that people have found to mitigate this obstacle is precisely a new technique, which also has to do with graphs. It's called GraphRag. So RAG standing for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And it's a way to sort of instruct, let's say, your language model to use a specific data set. And by doing so, the idea is that you should be able to get more accurate answers. So Gartner has also been seeing that apparently, and they chose to highlight it. And this, I guess, is part of the reason why they made knowledge graphs, why they thought that knowledge graphs are such an important technology. Now, I also think that there's something to be said about, the fact that as opposed to the rest of the technologies that are included in their emerging technologies radar, I think knowledge graphs probably the oldest out of those. They haven't always gone by that name, but by this name, or I don't know, semantic web or linked data or anything else, as a technology, as a concept, they've been around for, a couple of decades. And I've also been around for those last couple of decades, and that's how I know. So I think it's interesting that the technology that's this old still gets to be referenced alongside emerging technologies. But on the other hand, I also think that's probably part of the reason that, compared to those other emerging technologies, it's probably much more mature, and that probably contributes to it being highlighted among those.
So a quick question on that, and I imagine other people have similar questions, and if you do, you can always raise your hand or put a question in the Q&A section. I've been wondering, so to see it go from graphs and knowledge graphs go from not as well recognized to all of a sudden in the bullseye as an enabler, I was kind of surprised at that big shift and that quick shift. What do you think is behind that from a Gartner standpoint? Because all of us graph geeks, recognize the importance of graphs, but to see that kind of almost like a tipping point where Gartner is now putting it in the center of their AI enabler chart was kind of a surprise for me. I don't know, maybe it wasn't for you, but what do you think's behind that?
It wasn't such a big surprise for me, to be honest, and I started digging a little bit in past issues of the Year of the Graph, and even though, to be honest, I didn't have enough time to thoroughly browse through all of them to be able to pinpoint like exactly this is when it has appeared again. Just out of memory, I'm quite positive that Gartner has called out knowledge graphs and graph technology before, at least a couple of times, I would say. So it was definitely not the first. It may be the first time that they make it that prominent, but it's not the first. I remember actually probably was around 2020, at least one of those previous instances before, because I remember actually one of my mentors in this, who was also one of the forefathers of the semantic web in a way. So the leader of a research group I had the honor of joining for a few years, knowledge presentation and reasoning group in the University of Amsterdam, Frank van Harmelen. And I think it was him who basically made the same comment one of those previous times. And he was like, well, okay, so Gartner thinks this is a new technology. It's funny because it's been around for a long time, but at the same time, it's nice that they finally noticed.
So you mentioned GraphRag in that description of some of the callouts, and it's also very prominent in your most recent newsletter. And actually, it's prominent everywhere at the moment. But I've also heard some mixed reviews on how well the performance actually does in real world environments. So I'd love to hear a little more, and I'm sure the group would love to hear a little more about what you see as far as like the trends in GraphRag, and if you think the popularity or the intensity of interest will continue on this year or maybe wane as reality sets in. What are your thoughts there, George?
Yeah, that's a very good question, which actually I would actually say that it touches on a number of points, so I'll try and address those to the extent possible. So I'll start with naming, in fact. So GraphRag by now has been around long enough to already, already mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And that means that, it's sort of natural to happen for every term that's been around long enough and gets enough mindshare, basically. So and already I'm seeing people trying to come up with different subcategories, let's say, of this broad graph RAG category. I think to be able to sort of understand where the term is coming from and what it means, we should probably roll back a few months. And what I try to do when I'm against this sort of challenge, like, okay, what does this mean for myself? What does it mean for other people? Do we have a kind of common ground? Do we have a common understanding of what we're talking about? I try to pinpoint, like, okay, so how was the beginning of the use of that term and who introduced it, and then we go from there. I would say that conventionally, for most people at least, the term graph RAG sort of appeared in the beginning of 2024, so it's very recent. And I would conventionally pinpoint it to a publication by Microsoft that sort of introduced this term graph RAG. Now, that doesn't mean that Microsoft were the first ones that did it. Others have been doing that before Microsoft, but it's Microsoft that got the attention. It's in a kind of similar way that, well, obviously it wasn't OpenAI that were the first ones to experiment with large language models, but somehow they got, the mindset, and from that point on, people tend to associate large language models with OpenAI, and in the same way, people tend to associate GraphRag with Microsoft. Now, that said, Microsoft has a very specific approach to this, a very specific way of doing that, which is mostly, I would say, statistical. So what they do is they basically analyze text using statistical means, NLP and statistical means, and they sort of build a graph out of that. And then, consequently, they use that to be able to power their RAG pipeline. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only way you can go. So already I see people beginning to talk about knowledge graph RAG, meaning that, well, you can also create a graph that's not automatically auto-generated out of some text, the text that you're interested in pointing your model to, but you can actually build it by hand. Well, maybe you can also use some kind of tools to give you a starting point and then build on that. But anyhow, the idea is that, well, yes, it's obviously very easy if you have an auto-generated knowledge graph, but that doesn't necessarily make it the best fit for what you're trying to do. So there's different ways of building your graph in order to do graph RAG, and therefore what you're going to get out of that is also going to be different. And because this whole thing is so new, I don't think there's any sort of consensus on how to evaluate the performance of your graph RAG system. I mean, Microsoft published a benchmark that shows that their approach does better than conventional RAG, but as to how different RAG approaches, different graph RAG approaches, and different graph RAG implementation fare compared not to baseline RAG but to each other, I think it's quite early to be able to tell.
So there's a couple questions, or I think a comment and a question. So I'll go ahead and ask Rabi's question because he put it in the chat, and he's basically asking if you have some tips, like 3 tips to manage large amounts of inputs into LLMs. And I assume that is in conjunction with using graphs for that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts around that you can provide some tips.
I'm not sure if I have specific tips. What I can share is my own experience, my own exposure in building this sort of pipeline, which I have to be honest with you is quite limited, but it can maybe be somehow useful to people, so I'm going to share it. And in a way, you're also part of that, Amy. So you already mentioned in the introduction the fact that one of the things I do is I organize this event called Connected Data. And this year we're sort of returning to face-to-face events after a sort of hiatus after the COVID years. And so we're having this conference called Connected Data London at the end of the year in London, obviously. And so since we recently had our call for submissions published, we thought that it would be a good idea to organize a roundtable with the program chairs and some of our program committee members and myself and James Fair, who's my co-organizer in this event. And I'm saying that you were also part of this exposure and experience because for those of you who don't know, Amy is serving as one of our chairs in this event. So, long story short, we had an online roundtable. Amy was also part of that. It was great. It was about 90 minutes of online conversation. So, as you can probably imagine, there were many questions, many exchanges of opinion, many insights, many topics that we touched upon, and so on. And while it was great, that also meant that if we would like to summarize what was talked about and sort of extract the insights from that, it's always hard. It's super valuable, but it's also hard because you have to sort of rewind the conversation. You have to figure out, okay, so what are the themes that emerged? What are the speakers that were most prolific, and so on. So because of that, and because we've been talking about these GraphGeeks technologies and how they're put to use and all that, I thought I would do a little bit of an experiment trying to apply this technique to this particular conversation. So what I did was the following: we took the recording from the conversation and we extracted the transcripts. And we used that transcript as the basis of building a very primitive, really, GraphGeeks pipeline. And my findings from this very short exercise, and I say short because we didn't have much time to invest in it. So the idea was basically, okay, so what can we do originally the limit we set was 60 minutes. We sort of shifted the goalposts a little bit because I wanted to experiment a little bit more. So it ended up being, what can we do in 90 minutes or less? So the first part was curating the input for your GraphGeeks pipeline. And in our case, that meant basically the transcript. We have a specific tool that we use for this part, which gives pretty good results even out of the box, but it didn't get everything perfect. So speaker identification was not perfect, and also the transcript itself needed a little bit of polishing. That didn't take that long, but I think it was very, very necessary, because if we didn't do that, otherwise, even basic facts like who said what to whom and when, you would get wrong. And if you get these basic facts wrong, it doesn't really matter what happens further down the pipeline. Your outcome is going to be wrong. So that was necessary, and I think even though we often say that it never gets old and it should always be repeated. So the quality of the input matters. So you should really put some effort into making sure that what you use to feed your pipeline is as good as possible. And then the next step was we took an off-the-shelf tool and we tried to generate a knowledge graph based on that curated transcript. That also went pretty well. So I don't really want to refer to specific tools here. So obviously, it was a specific tool that we used, but that's sort of besides the point. I'm not here to, criticize or praise that specific tool. I just want to talk about the process and the pipeline. So it was fine. It worked. It gave us something that was sort of useful. And I say sort of useful because there were good parts and not so good parts about this process of auto-generating the knowledge graphs. The good part was, well, obviously that it was very fast. So from sign up to the tool to getting a knowledge graph out of it, it only took 20 minutes. And that's pretty remarkable, right on its own. It was also quite seamless, so it didn't take any fiddling. So all you had to do was basically provide the text input, and you got a knowledge graph in the end. And it was easy to navigate. Now, these are the good parts. The not so good parts were that, well, there was both redundancy and missing entities and relationships in the outcome. So that basically means that, well, it may be a good starting. Using a tool like this may be a good starting point, but it's no replacement for domain knowledge, basically. So, and when I talk about domain knowledge, I mean it in a sort of dual sense. So both the actual domain of what it is that your text is about. In this case, it was a bit of meta because it was about graph technologies anyhow. So, but it was also about people who were part of the conversation. And I found that you also have to be somehow versed in these technologies to be able to tweak the outcome. So in my case, it was relatively easy for me to do that. So I was able to do things such as edit labels or rename relationships or entities or these types of things because I was already familiar with some aspects of that tool. So it wasn't so hard. But for someone who's just starting, I think that's going to be not impossible, definitely, but probably not as easy. And then the third part was actually making that available. I mean, it was fine as a sort of exercise for myself to see, okay, can I actually do it? How hard is it going to be? Is anything useful going to come out of it? That was useful for me personally, but then I also wanted to make that available to others to be able to experiment with because, in a real world scenario, the idea is not just to have someone who knows how to do these things, build these things for themselves, but actually make it available for others to be able to ask questions and provide summaries and all of those things. So I wanted to see how easy it was going to be to make that available to others through any kind of interface. The textual interface was obviously sort of natural, so that people could ask questions. A visual interface could potentially also be useful. So if you could somehow visually browse that knowledge graph. But what I found out in the time that I had available was that this was not exactly easy, at least. Maybe it's doable, but it wasn't readily available, let's say. So I don't know if this counts as tips, but this is what I found out.
So what I heard, since we're talking about trends, and so I think what I heard from some of your answers in regards to GraphRag is, garbage in, garbage out is still important. And it's kind of interesting. I've been hearing a lot from practitioners that are having difficulty implementing GraphRag in a production environment, and a lot of it goes back to the garbage in, garbage out problem. This is only as good as the graph data you put in, and how you're able to clean it up. We have companies like Sensing who are really, very focused on entity resolution, and so there's all these old problems that don't go away just because we have a new approach. The other thing that I'm hearing is a trend as the need for domain expertise, which I completely agree that you can't AI your way out of having experts that can evaluate output, quality, and even the cleansing of the data. And then the third thing I heard, and I'm probably missing some things, but the third important thing is just the usability and the human interface as well as being really important. So, but I didn't hear, and it didn't sound, maybe you're not willing to say whether you thought if there will be a trough of disillusionment with Graph by the end of the year, or whether we're all going to be just as excited about it at the end of the year as we are now. So it's okay if you don't want to answer that, but that was one thing that I didn't hear.
It's a pretty easy one to answer, actually. So it's fine. I'm not sure if it's going to be at the end of the year, but I'm absolutely certain that there is going to be a certain disillusionment at this technology. And that's, we talked about Gartner earlier. Gartner has this famous adoption wave. So, every new technology comes with lots of inflated expectations. And I think probably for GraphRag, we're at the peak of inflated expectations at this moment. And then what happens after these inflated expectations is the so-called trough of disillusionment. So, I don't think it has with the technology itself, to be honest with you. It probably has more to do with, I don't know, human nature or market hype or both. But the thing is that whenever you have a new technology, people always think like, oh, okay, so this is like the solution to everything and it's going to solve all our problems. And obviously it doesn't. And so when people realize that this is the solution, oh, okay, so this didn't work either. Well, yes, nothing just magically works. You have to sort of verse yourself in the technology, and you have to apply it in the right way and in the right circumstances. And then yes, it can be good for solving a specific kind of problem in a specific kind of condition. So yes, there is going to be a sort of disillusionment. If it's going to be before the end of the year or after, I really don't know. But then what's also going to follow is what always follows. So people are going to realize, okay, so that's not the be-all and end-all, but it's useful. It's a useful tool. It works well in these scenarios. So people are going to apply it in these specific scenarios, and it's all going to end well.
Awesome. It will all end well. I love that positive thinking, George. And I do see some very specific questions come in, but looking at the time, I do want to get some of your thoughts on the graph database market, because that was also part of your analysis, is growth, impact of GQL or GQL. I'm never really sure how I should pronounce that. But yeah, George, so some of your thoughts on the graph database market itself, I think, would be important for people to understand in regards to trends.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, by the way, you're not the only one. I'm also not sure. And I guess in a way that's that already tells you that GQL is following in the footsteps of SQL, because you also have the is it SQL, SQL, I don't know. It's both. Yeah. I mean, you can use whatever. So yes, graph database market. That's also another example of this whole adoption wave and peak of inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, and then finally slope of enlightenment. Obviously, we're far more. We're at a different stage, because graph databases have been around for much longer than GraphRag. So I think we've already been through the peak of inflated expectations, and probably through the trough of disillusionment as well. So the only question is whether we're sort of at which part of the emerging slope, let's say, out of the trough of disillusionment we are at this point. There was a time, I guess, maybe a year or a couple of years back, when things were not looking that bright for graph database vendors, mostly because the technology itself does what it does. People still use it, and they probably always will. It was some vendors that didn't have such a rosy time, let's say, and there were some ups and downs in the market. That's also sort of normal. You also have to keep in mind that it's a quite fragmented, and in some people's opinions at least, maybe overpopulated market. So again, it was a technology that was very much hyped at some point, and so everyone was trying to get a piece of the action. There were some new vendors that entered this space. There were some vendors that were not traditionally graph database vendors per se, but there were also many multi-model database entries in this space. So lots of competition. The market probably didn't grow as fast and as much as some people were predicting. And so that probably meant that there was not that much space for everyone. There was some consolidation, again, sort of typical of the market cycles in any technology. What's happening now, though, is that, well, first of all, it seems that the market has somehow stabilized. So the key players are doing well. And by the way, I'd like to mention an infographic here that I also saw from some Gartner analysts, which was not specifically about the graph database market, but I liked it because it gave some kind of evidence for the part that the rest of us analysts are usually missing, because we don't have such a wide client base to draw from as Gartner does. So the infographic that a couple of Gartner analysts put out had to do with market shares, basically. It was obviously an estimate, because nobody can have 100% accurate data on the exact market shares for every vendor. But it was an approximation of market share based on their understanding from their clients. And in it, there were also two of the graph database vendors included. Well, I should probably say there were two pure graph database vendors, so TigerGraph and Neo4j, and there were also a couple of others that were more of a multi-model database. So there was DataStax, there was Redis, and a couple of others that I'm forgetting at the moment. But anyway, what's important is that infographic gave sort of an approximation of total clients, total sales, however it is you want to call it, over time. And in that, you could see that pretty much everyone that was included in that infographic was going up and to the right. And that already tells you that, well, the database market in total is going well. It's growing, the market is growing, and the graph database segment of that is also going well by extrapolation, but it's a pretty much safe conclusion. So it looks like the tough times are over, so to speak. There are also a couple of interesting, if you want to, there's a link to that infographic in the latest issue of the Year of the Graph. So there are a couple of interesting, inflection points over the timeline in that infographic. And, it would probably be a very, very much detailed and involved conversation to try and pinpoint those inflection points and try to come up with explanations as to why at this particular point in time there were these ups or these downs. But yeah, overall the market seems to be in a pretty good state at the moment.
Awesome. Another positive prediction. I'm feeling better already. One of the other items that you talk about in the newsletter is just general advances in Graph AI and GNN libraries as well. So I don't know if there's anything that kind of pops out of that you want to highlight. That would be, I'm sure, fascinating to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, it's a good for me to mention something which is a little bit meta, but probably useful for people at least to navigate both the newsletter and the Year of the Graph per se, the Year of the Graph, the site. So when I started this effort, which was back in 2017, I did it because I thought there was, for a number of reasons. First of all, I got a bit enthusiastic, to be honest with you, because as you also mentioned in the beginning, I've been in one way or another around these technologies for a long time. And 2017 was the time when I saw that, there's some kind of dynamics, let's say, in this market that people seem to be interested. These technologies are finding its space, let's say. So I thought, okay, we're in a situation where we have this previously niche technology that's now getting more attention. And it seemed back then that there were not enough resources for people to get, education, to get their background, to get their news. So I thought, there's this gap in the market. I think I can address it. So that was the birth of the Year of the Graph, basically. And in order to be able to navigate this space also for myself, I did this kind of breakdown that I've been following since. So in my mind, I divide, let's say, this whole graph space into four big categories. So knowledge graphs is one of them. We already talked about it in some length. There's also graph databases, which we just addressed previously. And we also have graph AI and graph analytics. And so to come to your question, graph AI is, and basically graph neural networks, is the one subdomain of all of these technologies that's first the newest entry, and also the one that I'm personally least well versed in. So I'm also sort of watching this and from a relative distance and trying to keep an eye on it and just learn from others who are much more experienced in this than myself. Having said that, I think that, to be honest with you, I'm not always comfortable following all the developments in the graph AI world. And I think, Amy, you're probably better versed in that particular subdomain than I am. But that said, I think in my mind, the more interesting thing that I saw in the last few months was graph AI libraries getting more mature. First, proliferating, because up until recently, it was basically the choice came down to either libraries, one of two libraries. And what I found interesting was that Apple also released its own flavor of library, also open source, and it seems to be, well supported and getting more mature. So I think that would be my highlight from the graph AI world.
It's interesting that I like the 4 categories kind of look, and I'm sure we could all, have a vigorous debate on, are those the right categories? Which ones are overlap? And should we look at it by uses versus technology? And those are all fun things to talk about. But I will say that the graph AI space, as you describe it, is probably the one that's least like all the others, which makes it kind of a specialty in and of itself, but also sometimes hard, like you said, hard to really follow what's going on. One of the things that I've noticed in that space which is interesting. I mean, there's a lot going on there in maturity, but I actually am starting to see a little bit of overlap or merging of some of the potential uses on the edges, with other knowledge graph and graph analytics uses. So it's kind of, for me, I find it interesting in that it used to feel completely separate, like we're talking about apples and oranges, and now I'm starting to see a little kind of edge bleed over, which I find fascinating. And I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing, who knows, but it is something that I've noticed as well. But I also wanted to give George a chance to mention some of the knowledge graph research that he calls out in the Year of the Graph report, because I feel like there's just so much going on there as well. So is any really exciting research that you would recommend that people definitely dive into?
I would actually, there's lots of there always is lots of exciting research in knowledge graphs, but I would actually probably turn people not so much to research, but what I would maybe call applied research. So people who published results about things that they actually did in production. And I find that's in a way that's the best of both worlds, because the organizations that these people work with, I mean, the sheer scale that they work at already makes their problems interesting in and of its own. Most people will probably not get to work at that scale and, at these stakes, let's say. So some of the things that caught my attention was how the people at Nobel Prize outreach built a knowledge graph. And that was super interesting because, I have to confess that part of the way I found it interesting, and besides the catchy name, obviously, Nobel Prize and all that, was the fact that I found some similarities in the work that we do with connected data. So obviously, we're nowhere near the scale or the importance of the Nobel Prize, but there is some similarity in the sense that, they do have lots of content. They do have body of accumulated knowledge, and the work that they did was based on that. So they were somehow able to get that body of knowledge together in a coherent way, and they built a knowledge graph out of that, which helped them navigate this knowledge in a more efficient and also more approachable way. And that was a big inspiration for us in connected data as well. And we would like to do something of the kind ourselves. Whether we're going to be as successful as these people were, I don't know, but we'll do our best anyhow. There's also some work from DoorDash, and I think that people there, to your point earlier about how Graph AI is sort of bleeding into other use cases, I think that's a good example of that. If my memory serves me right, the people at DoorDash built their knowledge graph, also leveraging, well, yes, large language models, but I think at some point they also used GNNs to help them build like a baseline for the knowledge graph. So that was an interesting use case as well. And by the way, both of these, when I refer to them as use cases, there's for both cases, there's also an archive publication to go with that. So, if you're so inclined, you can dig in and find more details. It's not just some abstract blog post or reference. You can actually find more details on those. And on the conceptual part, I would also probably call out some of the posts that Kurt Kegel has been writing on the trade-off, let's say, or on the exact way of working with large language models when building knowledge graphs or ontologies. And he's basically, I would really encourage people to read those. And if I were to give you like an overview of what these posts are about, Kurt is exploring the balance, let's say. First of all, he has experimented a lot with a number of different models and trying different ways to create knowledge graphs using those models. And he's sharing his experience. And if you want the TLDR version, it's basically that, well, no large language models can be of assistance in this process, but you should know what you're doing and you can't blindly trust the outcome, which is very much what I've also found out with my experience such as this.
Awesome. And I just put, I think, the wrong link for the Kegel report in the chat. I usually find him on LinkedIn, so I'll grab that in just a moment. I think I gave everyone an old one. But to your point, George, about looking at applied use cases, I think that goes back to a question from MNAT, where he was asking about GraphRag and whether you were aware of any applications, commercial applications out there, or most people still in kind of POC or experimentation. So if there's any like commercial use cases you can refer people to, that was something that MNAT wanted to see.
I at least at this point, no, I can't say that I'm aware of specific commercial applications. That maybe there are some out there, but well, at least I don't know them. And maybe the people who have actually deployed those applications in production have not yet had the chance to let the world know that, hey, this application that you're seeing is powered by GraphRag. I'm pretty sure we'll see some of those in the coming period.
Good point. And so if anybody is, has a list, that would be exciting. Feel free to drop me a note. I'm sure George would love to hear about it. You can also drop a note in the GraphGeeks Discord if you're not well, of course, and join if you're not already on it. We had a couple comments and examples on the GNN from, looks like, our Pranava. Thank you for adding some examples in there as well. So we appreciate that. To make sure we have a little bit of time to talk about Connected Data World and Connected Data London. You've referenced it a couple times, George, but people might not be aware of the event in that community. So if you could tell us a little bit about that. I'm participating. I'm super excited about it, but I think people would also like to hear from you about that event.
since its inauguration, we've been expanding the scope, and by now, as I mentioned, it covers pretty much all things graph. So we have knowledge graphs, we have graph AI, graph data science. We also have some semantic technology, so I kind of know the history of the event, graph databases, obviously. And besides having this, big tent approach in terms of the technologies that we cover, we like to think that we also do the same in terms of the audience that we try to address. So we like to cater to everyone. So we have all kinds of sessions, ranging from the very hardcore and on the latest innovations and the latest research, all the way to more high level and more business-oriented presentations.
Thank you so much for your time, your thoughts today, and all the research that you do. We all really appreciate it. You're the Graph. Google it, sign up for it. It's a wonderful research and just a lot of effort that George gives and provides to the community. So thank you again, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.